The issue of extending voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds is one that has gained momentum recently. Make It 16 campaign co-director Cate Tipler is with me now. And Kate, tell us about why you believe the interests of young people aren't being represented in the current scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen it recently with issues like education come up. You know, the pandemic is affecting high school students quite a lot. We've had students not be able to go to school because they've had to drop out and work. We've had students not be able to go to school because there aren't enough teachers staffing schools. And all of this is affecting young people the most. But leaders aren't listening to what we're saying. And I do believe that's largely because a lot of young people aren't the voter base that politicians are trying to target.
So we were talking before about the 2020 election, and issues like education, climate change are very hot for young people. Did we see enough of these topics even come up during that campaign?
No, absolutely we didn't. Young people were trying to ask these questions to politicians and we were being brushed over because they don't care, because we can't vote. So these issues that actually will affect every single member of society aren't being discussed by politicians because they're seen as young people issues and not an issue worth discussing because young people can't vote.
Okay, let's get the counter-arguments out of the way, and I'm sure they're put to you all the time. 16 and 17-year-olds not mature enough and maybe brain not fully matured and all that kind of thing. How do you counter that?
Look, there's so many ways we can counter it, but something we come back to often is actually there are other countries that have a voting age of 16, notably Scotland, notably Wales, that have democracies that are quite similar to ours actually, and 16 and 17-year-olds voting there has been a massive success. You know, 16 and 17-year-olds turn out to vote in higher rates than 18 to 24-year-olds, and it didn't end the world when 16-year-olds turned out to vote in Scotland and Wales.
In Scotland, for example, are there any conditions on a 16 or 17-year-old voting, or do they have full voting rights like anybody else?
Yeah, so how 16 and 17-year-olds got the vote in Scotland was because there was a Scottish independence referendum. And actually the leaders in Scotland looked and said, this issue is going to impact young people the most. We should give young people the right to vote and have their say on this issue. And I think that same logic can be applied in various areas too. I mean, it most definitely can be applied when it comes to voting on climate policy, because the climate policy of today will end up impacting young people the most.
I wonder if it did affect the election there, though, because, I mean, I would think young people would want independence in general, but actually independence was voted down in that election. Do you think it had an effect? Like, do we know that young people voting actually has a numerical effect on the outcome?
Well, look, regardless of how much of a difference it makes, I think it's important to just give young people a say at all. What we did see in that Scottish election, which was interesting, is that often people will say 16 and 17-year-olds won't turn out to vote, but actually 74% of 16 and 17-year-olds turned out to vote in that election. Only 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds turned out to vote in that election, but subsequently the 16 and 17-year-olds who became the 18 to 24-year-olds turned out to vote in higher rates than the original lot. Right. So what I think that shows is if we lower the voting age now, we'll see the positive impact over the next 10 years of young people voting.
Yeah, it's seeding a different kind of voting behaviour.
Exactly. It's creating new voting behaviours. You know, just because we let 16 and 17-year-olds vote now, it does mean that they will continue voting for the rest of their lives.
Do you ever get the sense that a whole life happens on social media? I get this in business journalism, where a whole set of different ideas is going on social media, and there's a generation that just are not connected in there. And so there's sort of like two ecosystems happening in the world.
Well, I think social media is a really interesting point because all age groups are on social media, different social medias, but they are all on social media now. It's where a lot of people get their information from regardless of age. But what young people are doing is they're using social media to connect with each other. They're using social media to see viewpoints that are different from their own. And I think that's what will make young people incredibly informed and connected voters.
Some people say that lowering the voting age favours the left of politics, and I'm sure you've heard that before. What would you say to that?
Young people are going to vote for policies that help young people. We know that by lowering the voting age, all politicians across the political spectrum will now be forced to create policy and engage with young people on what young people want to see. That doesn't have to be specific to any one party. Any politicians can choose policy that helps young people. I mean, even in our own campaign, we have people advocating for lowering the voting age who support Labour, but we have people advocating for lowering the voting age who support National and who support ACT and who support New Zealand First. So I don't think it's any one political party issue, and that we'll see young people vote across the political spectrum.
So let's talk about New Zealand politicians. Which politicians or parties are supporting you in this quest?
So we know the Greens and Te Pāti Māori have been openly favourable to our campaign, but what we also know is that there's members of Labour and there's members of National who privately support us, and it's just about, providing them with the political capital to actually have the courage to speak up. There are members of Parliament who know lowering the voting age is the right thing to do. They do just need to have the guts to stand up and say it.
So the campaign launched in the wake of the 2020 election. What's the legal progression of this campaign since then?
Yep, so we do have a court case going through the courts at the moment. We're going to the Supreme Court in July. What we were aiming for is a declaration of inconsistency. So we know that the Bill of Rights Act protects anyone over the age of 16. So the fact that we have a voting age of 18 is inconsistent with the Bill of Rights Act, which shows that fundamentally this is a human rights issue. The Court of Appeal last year didn't give us that declaration of inconsistency, but they did say that the Crown cannot justify a voting age of 18, which has given us grounds to go to the Supreme Court later this year.
Right, and who's funding this? Because it's not cheap to take this kind of case.
No, so luckily we're very lucky to have lawyers working for us pro bono, and we have support from the courts who've waived some of those fees for us.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so let's say the Supreme Court rules in your favour or gives you what you're after. How soon after that could youth voting be implemented, do you think?
Look, that's a question for Parliament. We know right now that lowering the voting age is the right thing to do. It takes a 51% majority in Parliament to lower the voting age for local elections. Labour could literally do it tomorrow. And we know that if the Supreme Court rules in our favour, that does show that this is a human rights issue. And then the onus is on Parliament to act on this human rights issue.
Cate, thank you very much for coming in and talking to MBR.
Thank you.